Tonight, we journey back nearly 2,000 years to the heart of the Roman Empire, a world of marble temples, crowded streets, powerful emperors, and bustling cities that stretched across 3 continents. It is a world often remembered for its armies, gladiators, senators, and grand monuments. Yet beneath the glory of Rome existed another world, one rarely discussed by historians and almost entirely forgotten by time. It was a world of ordinary workers whose daily labor allowed the empire to function. Among them was a man whose life unfolded inside one of Rome's most important institutions, the public baths. When most people imagine ancient Rome, they picture the Colosseum, mighty legions, or wealthy nobles draped in fine clothing. Few stopped to consider the enormous bath complexes that stood at the center of Roman society. These baths were far more than places to wash. They were social centers, meeting halls, business hubs, exercise facilities, libraries, and gathering places where people from nearly every level of society spent hours each day. Thousands of citizens passed through their gates. Senators discussed politics, merchants negotiated deals, soldiers relaxed after long duties, travelers sought comfort far from home, philosophers debated ideas, friends met, families gathered, and entire communities revolved around these magnificent buildings. Yet while visitors enjoyed the luxury of warm water, heated rooms, and elegant architecture, countless workers labored behind the scenes to keep everything functioning. Fires had to be maintained day and night. Water systems required constant attention. Floors needed cleaning. Supplies had to be delivered. Furnaces demanded endless fuel. Among these workers was the bath attendant, a man whose life was spent ensuring that thousands of others could enjoy comfort and relaxation. His name would never be carved into stone monuments. No historian would record his accomplishments. No statues would be built in his honor. Yet without people like him, the great Roman baths could not have operated for even a single day. Tonight, we will follow the forgotten life of one such attendant. We will experience the sights, sounds, and routines of a profession hidden behind the grandeur of the empire. We will walk through steaming corridors before sunrise, tend roaring furnaces beneath vast marble halls, carry water, clean floors, assist visitors, and witness daily life inside one of the most remarkable public institutions ever created. We will discover what it was like to work while others relaxed, to remain unseen while serving thousands, and to spend a lifetime supporting an empire from the shadows. Imagine yourself standing outside a massive Roman bath complex as dawn slowly breaks over the city. The streets are still quiet. The marble walls glow faintly in the morning light. Soon crowds will arrive, but for now only workers move through the entrances. Somewhere deep beneath the building, furnaces are already burning. Water is already flowing through pipes. Preparations have begun long before the first customer arrives. In this hidden world below the polished floors and elegant halls, the day of a Roman bath attendant is already underway. So settle comfortably, leave the modern world behind, and allow yourself to drift back through the centuries. Tonight, we enter the steaming heart of ancient Rome and uncover the forgotten life of a Roman bath attendant. Long before the citizens of Rome awoke and filled the streets with noise, the bath attendant's day had already begun. The city still slept beneath the fading darkness of night as he stepped onto the stone roads leading toward the great bath complex where he worked. The air was cool, carrying the faint smell of smoke from household hearths that had burned through the night. Around him, only a few people were awake at such an hour. Bakers prepared bread for the coming day. Laborers hauled supplies through quiet streets. Guards changed shifts at city gates. Most Romans remained in their homes, unaware that beneath the marble halls of the baths, a small army of workers was already preparing the building for another day. As the attendant approached the massive structure, he could see its enormous silhouette rising above nearby buildings. The baths were among the largest structures in the city. Towering walls, grand entrances, statues, fountains, gardens, and wide courtyards greeted visitors during the day. To ordinary citizens, the baths appeared almost magical. Warm water flowed endlessly. Floors remained clean. Pools sparkled. Heated rooms maintained perfect temperatures. Yet the attendant knew the truth. None of it happened by itself. Behind every comfortable experience enjoyed by guests stood hours of labor performed by workers who would never receive recognition. Passing through a side entrance reserved for employees, he entered a world most visitors never saw. Beneath the elegant halls stretched a maze of service corridors, storage rooms, workshops, and furnace chambers. These underground passages formed the hidden heart of the bath complex. Here there were no marble decorations or wealthy patrons discussing politics. Instead, there were stacks of firewood, piles of charcoal, tools, carts, buckets, and exhausted workers beginning another demanding day. One of the attendants' first responsibilities involved checking the furnaces. The Roman baths relied upon an ingenious heating system known today as the hypocaust. Massive furnaces burned continuously beneath the building. Hot air traveled through empty spaces beneath floors and inside walls, warming entire rooms from below. To visitors, the heated floors felt luxurious. To the workers maintaining them, they represented endless labor. The fires consumed enormous amounts of fuel every day. If the furnaces cooled, entire sections of the baths could become unusable. Descending deeper into the service areas, the attendant reached the furnace chambers. The heat struck him immediately. Even before sunrise, the rooms felt like ovens. Flames roared inside large brick furnaces while workers shoveled fuel into the fire. Sweat covered their faces despite the cool weather outside. The attendant inspected the fires carefully. As the morning progressed, the bath complex transformed into one of the busiest places in the city. What had been a quiet collection of halls and pools before sunrise was now alive with conversation, laughter, splashing water, and the endless movement of people. Citizens entered through the grand entrances in a steady stream. Some arrived alone, others with friends, relatives, or business partners. For many Romans, visiting the baths was not merely about cleanliness. It was one of the most important social activities of daily life. Important conversations happened here. Friendships were maintained here. Business deals were negotiated here. News spread here faster than almost anywhere else in the city. Standing near one of the main corridors, the bath attendant watched the crowds grow larger with every passing hour. He had seen this scene countless times, yet it never failed to impress him. Wealthy senators wearing fine tunics walked through the same halls as craftsmen, laborers, and retired soldiers. Although social divisions remained important throughout Roman society, the baths brought together people from many different backgrounds in ways that few other places could. The attendant's duties now shifted from preparation to constant service. Visitors frequently needed assistance. Some required directions to different sections of the baths. Others asked questions about available facilities. New arrivals often needed help finding changing rooms or storing personal belongings. The attendant moved continuously throughout the building, answering questions and solving small problems before they became larger ones. The work demanded patience. Hundreds of interactions occurred every day. Some visitors were polite and appreciative. Others were demanding, impatient, or rude. The attendant learned long ago not to take such behavior personally. Most customers rarely thought about the workers serving them. They expected everything to function smoothly without considering the effort required to maintain such a massive facility. One of the busiest areas was the apoditerium, the changing room where visitors stored clothing before entering the baths. The room filled quickly as more citizens arrived. Wooden benches lined the walls. Storage spaces held garments and personal items. Theft occasionally occurred, making attendants especially valuable. Part of the attendant's responsibility involved keeping order and helping visitors protect their belongings. It was not glamorous work, but it was necessary. A missing purse or stolen cloak could quickly ruin a visitor's experience and create problems for the staff. Beyond the changing rooms lay the sequence of bathing chambers that made Roman baths famous throughout the empire. Visitors typically moved through several different rooms during their visit. Some began with exercise in open courtyards. Others entered warm rooms immediately. The attendant frequently traveled between these areas, ensuring that everything remained clean and properly maintained. The tepidarium, a comfortably warm chamber, often served as a transition space where guests relaxed before entering hotter rooms. Beyond it stood the caldarium, the hottest chamber in the baths. Here steam filled the air, and heated pools offered deep relaxation. The attendant entered these rooms regularly while performing his duties. Despite years of experience, the intense heat remained exhausting. Sweat formed almost instantly. The air felt heavy. Visitors enjoyed these conditions because they stayed only temporarily. Workers sometimes endured them for hours. Meanwhile, the furnaces beneath the building continued burning without pause. The heating system required constant attention. Throughout the day, attendants carried messages between supervisors and furnace workers. Temperatures had to remain stable. Fuel supplies needed monitoring. Any failure could affect hundreds of visitors. The bath complex resembled a living machine with countless moving parts. Everyone performed specific roles, and each role depended upon the others. Around midday, the baths reached their busiest period. Every pool seemed crowded, every corridor filled with movement. Voices echoed from marble walls. Water splashed continuously. The scent of olive oil, perfumes, and steam mixed together in the air. To an outsider, the scene might have appeared chaotic. To the attendant, it represented a carefully managed system functioning exactly as intended. Years of experience allowed him to recognize problems immediately. A blocked drain, a shortage of towels, an overheated room, a damaged bench. Small issues could quickly become serious if ignored. Constant vigilance was part of the profession. Yet amid the endless work, the attendant occasionally found moments to observe the fascinating variety of people passing through the baths. Merchants discussed trade routes stretching across the empire. Soldiers shared stories from distant frontiers. Politicians debated local affairs. Philosophers argued about ideas. Travelers described cities many Romans would never see. Although the attendant occupied a humble position, he witnessed a remarkable cross-section of Roman life every single day. Few places in the empire brought together such a diverse collection of people under one roof. As afternoon sunlight streamed through high windows and reflected across the water, the attendant realized that the busiest hours were still far from over. The crowds showed no sign of thinning. More visitors continued arriving. More tasks awaited completion. The day inside the baths was only halfway finished, and countless challenges still lay ahead before evening finally arrived. By the middle of the afternoon, the baths were operating at full capacity. Every pool contained bathers, every corridor echoed with conversation, and nearly every attendant inside the complex was moving constantly from one task to another. For visitors, this was the most enjoyable part of the day. Many had completed their work and now sought relaxation. For the bath attendant, however, the busiest hours had only just begun. While guests lounged in heated pools and discussed politics, business, or local gossip, workers behind the scenes struggled to keep the enormous complex functioning smoothly. The attendant rarely remained in one place for long. One moment he might be helping visitors inside the changing rooms, and the next he could be carrying supplies through underground service corridors. The baths were like a small city hidden inside a larger city. Above ground, marble halls, fountains, and pools impressed visitors. Below ground, a hidden network of tunnels, storage rooms, furnace chambers, and maintenance passages formed an entirely different world. Most guests never saw these areas, yet much of the attendant's day was spent there. One of the most important supplies used throughout the baths was olive oil. Unlike modern bathing methods, Romans did not primarily use soap. Instead, bathers covered their skin with oil and then scraped away dirt, sweat, and oil using a curved metal tool called a strigil. This process left the skin clean and refreshed. Because thousands of visitors used the baths every week, enormous quantities of olive oil were consumed. The attendant often helped transport jars of oil from storage areas to various sections of the complex. The containers were heavy, especially when carried repeatedly throughout the day. Yet, without these supplies, many visitors would consider their bathing experience incomplete. The attendant also encountered a surprising variety of personalities during his work. Some customers treated him with respect. Wealthy patrons occasionally offered small tips for exceptional service. Others barely acknowledged his existence. Certain visitors viewed attendants as little more than part of the building itself, noticing them only when something went wrong. Over time, the attendant learned to accept this reality. His role was not to be admired. His purpose was to ensure that the baths operated efficiently. Success often meant becoming invisible. If visitors spent their day enjoying themselves without thinking about the workers around them, then the attendants had done their jobs well. Throughout the afternoon, he frequently passed through the palestra, an open exercise courtyard attached to the baths. Here visitors lifted weights, wrestled, practiced athletic exercises, and prepared their bodies before bathing. The area was always lively. Young men competed to demonstrate strength. Retired soldiers shared stories of military campaigns. Friends challenged one another to friendly contests. The attendant often found the courtyard fascinating because it revealed how important physical fitness remained within Roman culture. Even men who spent most of their lives behind desks or market stalls often participated in exercise before entering the pools. Yet not every part of the baths was peaceful. Disagreements occasionally erupted between visitors. Arguments about politics, business, gambling, or personal rivalries sometimes became heated. When tensions rose, attendants often found themselves attempting to calm situations before they disrupted other guests. Fortunately, serious violence was uncommon. Most disputes ended with angry words rather than physical confrontations. Even so, maintaining order formed another hidden responsibility of the profession. A well-run bath complex depended upon more than warm water and clean floors. It also required a safe and welcoming atmosphere. As the hours passed, the attendant began noticing familiar faces among the crowd. Many Romans visited the baths almost every day. Regular customers developed routines. Some arrived at exactly the same hour each afternoon. Others preferred specific pools or rooms. Certain elderly visitors spent hours discussing philosophy. Merchants frequently met business partners near particular benches. The attendant gradually learned these habits through observation. In many ways, the baths served as a mirror reflecting the daily life of the city itself. Watching the visitors was like watching Rome breathe. The rich and poor, the powerful and ordinary, the young and old all flowed through the complex in a constant cycle. During a brief pause in his duties, the attendant stood near one of the larger pools and looked around. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, reflecting across the water and illuminating drifting clouds of steam. Marble columns rose toward high ceilings. Voices echoed softly throughout the chamber. For a moment, the baths appeared almost magical. Visitors saw luxury, comfort, and beauty. Yet the attendant knew how much effort hid beneath that elegance. Beneath the polished floors, furnaces still roared. Workers still carried fuel. Maintenance crews still repaired damaged equipment. Countless unseen hands supported every pleasant experience occurring above. The beauty of the baths rested upon an invisible foundation of labor. As afternoon slowly moved toward evening, the attendant felt the first signs of exhaustion creeping into his muscles. His feet ached from hours of walking. His clothing was damp from heat and steam. Yet there was still much work ahead. The crowds remained large. The furnaces still required attention. Supplies needed replenishing. Cleaning tasks were already beginning in areas where visitors had moved on. The day was far from over. In fact, some of the most demanding responsibilities would only begin once the last guests finally departed and the great bath complex entered its nightly transformation. As evening approached, the atmosphere inside the baths began to change. The bright energy of the afternoon slowly softened into something calmer. Many visitors had already spent several hours inside the complex. Business discussions were ending. Exercise sessions had concluded. Groups of friends relaxed in warm pools while conversations became quieter and more reflective. Golden sunlight streamed through high windows, casting long shadows across marble floors and filling the halls with a warm glow. To many guests, this was the most pleasant time of day. The noise of the city seemed distant. The baths offered a final opportunity to unwind before returning home. For the bath attendant, however, the evening marked the beginning of an entirely different phase of work. Throughout the day, his responsibilities had focused on serving visitors. Now he increasingly turned his attention toward preparing for the massive cleanup that would follow closing time. As he moved through the complex, he quietly observed the effects of thousands of people using the facilities. Water had splashed onto floors. Benches needed wiping down. Oil containers required refilling. Storage rooms needed reorganizing. Small repairs had accumulated throughout the day. None of these issues were immediately noticeable to visitors, yet together they represented hours of labor waiting to be completed. The baths might appear magnificent on the surface, but maintaining that appearance demanded constant effort. One of the attendants' regular tasks involved inspecting the pools. Roman baths contained multiple pools of different temperatures, each serving a specific purpose. Some were warm and relaxing, while others were heated to create intense steam. Maintaining water quality was an endless challenge. Debris occasionally found its way into the pools. Leaves entered through courtyards. Dust settled on surfaces. Visitors themselves contributed to the workload despite efforts to stay clean. Throughout the evening, attendants carefully monitored conditions, ensuring that everything remained acceptable until closing time. Meanwhile, the social life of Rome continued unfolding around him. The baths remained one of the most important gathering places in the empire. Standing near a doorway or pool, the attendant often overheard fascinating conversations. Wealthy merchants discussed ships arriving from Egypt carrying grain and luxury goods. Former soldiers recounted stories from distant frontiers along the Rhine or Danube. Politicians debated local issues. Travelers described cities many Romans would never see. The attendant occupied a unique position. Though he rarely participated in these discussions, he witnessed them all. Few people in Rome encountered such a wide variety of individuals each day. In many ways, the baths served as a miniature version of the empire itself. As darkness gradually approached, workers began lighting lamps throughout the complex. Their soft glow reflected across marble walls and shimmering water. The atmosphere became almost dreamlike. Steam drifted through the air while flickering light created moving shadows on columns and ceilings. Visitors continued arriving even during the evening hours. Some Romans preferred bathing after sunset, particularly during warmer months when the daytime heat could be uncomfortable. For attendants, this meant that work often continued much later than outsiders realized. The baths did not simply close when the sun disappeared. Activity frequently lasted well into the night. Eventually, however, the moment arrived when the final guests began leaving. The crowd slowly thinned. Conversations faded. Footsteps became less frequent. One by one, rooms emptied. Visitors collected their belongings and returned to the city beyond the bath walls. For most Romans, the day inside the baths had ended. For the attendants, another demanding shift was just beginning. Once the doors closed, the entire complex underwent a nightly transformation. Cleaning crews moved systematically through every section of the building. Floors were scrubbed, benches were wiped down, waste was removed, supplies were counted and replenished. Damaged equipment was identified for repair. The attendant joined dozens of other workers in these efforts. There was no time to waste. Everything needed to be ready before the next morning's visitors arrived. Deep beneath the baths, furnace workers continued their labor. Although some fires were reduced, many could not be allowed to go out completely. Restarting the heating system from scratch would require enormous effort. As a result, workers maintained critical furnaces throughout the night. The attendant occasionally descended into these underground chambers carrying supplies or messages. The contrast between the elegant halls above and the harsh working conditions below remained striking. Visitors spent their evenings relaxing in warm water. Beneath their feet, laborers sweated beside roaring fires, ensuring that the luxury continued uninterrupted. Near midnight, exhaustion settled heavily upon the attendant. His legs ached from walking. His hands were sore from lifting and carrying supplies. The heat of the baths lingered on his skin. Yet, despite the fatigue, there was satisfaction in seeing the enormous complex gradually restored to order. Room by room, corridor by corridor, the signs of the day's activity disappeared. The baths became quiet once again. The crowds were gone. The conversations had ended. Only workers remained, moving through silent halls illuminated by flickering lamps. Standing alone beside one of the great pools, now calm and nearly empty, the attendant gazed across the still water. The vast building felt completely different without visitors. Peaceful, mysterious, almost sacred. In a few short hours, everything would begin again. New crowds would arrive. New conversations would unfold. New tasks would demand attention. But for this brief moment, in the silence of the sleeping baths, the attendant could appreciate the hidden world he inhabited. A world most Romans never saw, yet one that made their daily comfort possible. By the time midnight passed, most of Rome was asleep, yet the hidden world beneath the baths remained active. The bath attendant often found these hours the strangest part of his profession. During the day, the complex belonged to the public. Thousands of voices filled the halls. Water splashed endlessly. Merchants argued. Philosophers debated. And friends laughed together. But after closing time, the baths became something entirely different. The vast marble chambers stood nearly silent. Footsteps echoed across empty corridors. Steam drifted lazily through dimly lit rooms. Shadows danced along walls illuminated only by oil lamps. For workers like the attendant, these quiet hours revealed the true scale of the building. Without crowds to distract the eye, the baths felt enormous. The ceilings seemed higher. The halls appeared longer. The pools reflected flickering light like mirrors. Sometimes, while carrying supplies through deserted passageways, the attendant felt as though he were walking through a city abandoned by its inhabitants. Yet despite the silence above, intense labor continued below. The furnaces remained the heart of the entire operation. Deep beneath the floors, workers fed wood and charcoal into roaring fires that never truly rested. The attendant occasionally helped transport fuel into these underground chambers. The work was exhausting. Heavy bundles of wood had to be carried through narrow passages where the air felt thick with heat and smoke. Sweat soaked clothing within minutes. Ash covered hands and faces. The furnace workers endured conditions far harsher than those experienced by most attendants. Their labor was relentless, but without them the famous Roman baths would quickly become useless. Few visitors ever considered the hidden workforce sweating beneath their feet while they enjoyed warm pools and heated rooms. As he moved through the underground corridors, the attendant often reflected on how much of Roman society depended upon unseen labor. Everywhere in the empire, magnificent buildings stood because ordinary workers maintained them. Roads existed because laborers repaired them. Aqueducts carried water because engineers and maintenance crews kept them functioning. The baths were no different. Wealthy citizens received the praise and attention, but countless anonymous workers quietly supported the systems that made Roman life possible. In many ways, the attendant felt proud to be part of that hidden world. His name might never be remembered, yet his efforts mattered every single day. Near the storage areas, he sometimes worked alongside slaves responsible for moving supplies throughout the complex. Their lives were often far more difficult than his own. Some had been captured during wars. Others had been born into slavery. They performed much of the heaviest labor inside the baths, hauling fuel, transporting water, and carrying equipment. The attendant occasionally spoke with them while working. Though their backgrounds differed greatly, long hours often created a sense of shared understanding among workers. Everyone understood exhaustion. Everyone understood responsibility. And everyone understood that tomorrow would bring another demanding day. As the night progressed, maintenance work became increasingly important. Small problems discovered during the day could now be addressed without disrupting visitors. Cracked tiles were repaired. Damaged benches were reinforced. Drains were cleared. Leaking pipes received attention. The Roman baths relied upon remarkably advanced engineering, but even the finest systems required constant maintenance. Water flowed through miles of pipes. Heated air traveled beneath floors. Pools circulated enormous quantities of water. Any failure could affect hundreds or even thousands of visitors. The attendant spent part of nearly every night assisting with these repairs. Around the darkest hours before dawn, fatigue settled heavily across the workforce. Conversations became quieter. Movements slowed. Even experienced workers struggled to remain energetic after such long shifts. Yet these final hours before sunrise were also among the most important. Everything needed to be completed before the city awakened. Visitors expected perfection. They would arrive in the morning assuming the baths had somehow remained clean, warm, and organized on their own. The workers' success depended upon remaining invisible. If guests noticed signs of the previous day's wear and tear, the attendants had failed. Shortly before dawn, the attendant climbed a staircase leading from the underground service corridors into one of the great central halls. The room stood empty except for a few workers completing final preparations. Soft morning light had begun filtering through the highest windows. The new day was approaching. Looking across the polished marble floor, he felt a sense of accomplishment. Hours earlier, the baths had been crowded, noisy, and chaotic. Now they appeared pristine once again, ready to welcome thousands of visitors. It was a transformation most Romans never witnessed. They saw only the finished result. The effort remained hidden. As the first hints of sunrise illuminated the city beyond the bath walls, the attendant realized that another cycle was beginning. Soon the gates would open, crowds would return, conversations would fill the halls. The endless rhythm of the baths would continue exactly as it had yesterday and exactly as it would tomorrow. For the workers, there were no grand victories or dramatic changes. There was only the steady repetition of responsibility. Yet within that repetition existed something important. The baths functioned because people like him showed up every day and did their jobs well. And in the vast machinery of the Roman Empire, that quiet reliability was more valuable than most citizens would ever understand. Years passed, and the bath attendant's life settled into a rhythm that rarely changed. At first, he had measured time through seasons and festivals, but eventually the baths themselves became his calendar. He could tell whether it was summer or winter simply by observing the crowds. During hot months, visitors arrived earlier and stayed longer, seeking relief from the heat. During colder seasons, the heated chambers became even more popular, filled with Romans eager to escape chilly winds blowing through the streets. Emperors changed. New laws were announced. Merchants came and went. Children grew into adults. Yet the baths remained constant, and so did the attendants' duties. Every morning began before sunrise. Every evening ended long after most citizens had returned home. The routine was exhausting, but after many years it felt as natural as breathing. He knew every corridor of the complex, every storage room, every furnace chamber, and every hidden passage beneath the floors. There were sections of the baths he could navigate in complete darkness. New workers often became lost in the maze like tunnels beneath the building, but the attendant moved through them with confidence. The baths had become more familiar to him than his own home. Sometimes he joked that he spent more time beneath the marble halls than under his own roof, and in many ways it was true. The complex had become a second world, hidden beneath the visible city of Rome. One afternoon, while assisting visitors near the caldarium, he noticed a young worker struggling with a task that had once challenged him years earlier. The boy carried supplies awkwardly, moving too slowly and making mistakes born from inexperience. Watching him stirred memories of his own first days in the baths. He remembered feeling overwhelmed by the size of the complex and intimidated by the endless responsibilities. Back then, older workers had taught him the tricks of the trade. They had shown him how to monitor furnace temperatures, how to spot maintenance problems before they became serious, and how to deal with difficult customers. Without realizing it, he had gradually become one of those experienced workers himself. Soon he found himself offering advice to the younger employees. He explained procedures, demonstrated techniques, and shared lessons learned through years of experience. The realization felt strange. The young attendant who once needed guidance had become the veteran others relied upon. As the months passed, he increasingly found satisfaction in helping new workers succeed. The baths required teamwork. No single person could manage such a massive facility alone. Knowledge had to be passed from one generation of workers to the next. In this way, the complex survived despite constant changes among its staff. One evening, a wealthy senator visited the baths accompanied by several guests. Such visits often created additional work because important individuals expected exceptional service. Attendants hurried to ensure everything appeared flawless. Yet, as the attendant watched the senator relax beside a heated pool, he noticed something interesting. Despite the difference in status, the senator behaved much like everyone else. He laughed with friends. He complained about minor inconveniences. He enjoyed the warm water. In the baths, social distinctions still existed, but they sometimes seemed less important than they appeared elsewhere. For a few hours, many Romans shared the same spaces and experiences regardless of rank. It was one of the reasons the baths remained so popular throughout the empire. They offered not only comfort but also a rare sense of community. The attendant often reflected on the countless lives that passed through the complex. Over the years, he had watched children grow into adults. He had seen young soldiers depart for military service and later return as veterans. He had witnessed merchants become wealthy and others lose everything. He had heard news of wars, triumphs, disasters, and celebrations. The baths were more than a building. They were a crossroads where the stories of thousands of people intersected every day. Although he remained largely unnoticed, the attendant occupied a unique position. He observed Roman life unfolding from a perspective few others possessed. As evening arrived and lamps illuminated the halls, he paused near one of the largest pools. The water reflected the golden light, creating shimmering patterns across the ceiling. Visitors relaxed after long days. Conversations drifted through the air. Somewhere beneath the floor, furnaces continued burning steadily. For a moment, everything seemed perfectly balanced. The baths functioned exactly as intended. Workers performed their duties. Guests enjoyed their leisure. The machinery of Roman society turned smoothly onward. Standing there, the attendant realized he had spent much of his life helping maintain this balance. He would never become rich. He would never gain fame. Yet every day, through countless small actions, he contributed to something larger than himself. And as he watched the reflections dance across the water, he felt a quiet sense of pride in the forgotten role he played within the heart of ancient Rome. As the years continued to pass, the bath attendant became one of the most experienced workers in the entire complex, even though few visitors knew his name. New attendants arrived every year, nervous and uncertain just as he had once been, while older workers retired, disappeared, or simply faded from memory. Yet he remained. The baths had become his world. He knew every marble corridor, every hidden staircase, every storage room, and every underground passage beneath the vast complex. He could navigate the furnace tunnels in near darkness and identify problems before most people noticed them. The building no longer felt like a workplace. It felt like a living thing whose every breath and movement he understood. During one especially busy summer, Rome welcomed an enormous number of travelers from across the empire. Merchants from Egypt, sailors from Hispania, soldiers from Britannia, and officials from distant provinces crowded the streets. The baths became busier than ever before. From sunrise until late evening, visitors filled every room. The pools overflowed with bathers, changing rooms remained crowded, and attendants rushed endlessly from one task to another. The bath attendant often felt as if the entire Roman world had gathered beneath one roof. The increased activity created new challenges. Supplies disappeared rapidly. Olive oil had to be replenished constantly. Towels required replacing. Floors became dirty almost as quickly as they were cleaned. Yet despite the exhaustion, he found something fascinating in watching so many different people pass through the complex. Every face carried a different story. Some visitors spoke with unfamiliar accents. Others wore clothing from distant regions. Through the baths, he experienced a small glimpse of the vast empire stretching far beyond the city walls. During this period, he developed a close friendship with an elderly furnace worker named Lucius. The old man had spent decades beneath the baths feeding fuel into the massive furnaces that powered the hypocaust heating system. His skin was permanently darkened by soot. His hands were rough and scarred from years of labor, yet he possessed a calm wisdom that impressed everyone who knew him. Whenever they worked together, Lucius shared observations about life, work, and the empire itself. One evening, while loading charcoal into a furnace, he paused and looked toward the ceiling above them. Somewhere overhead, hundreds of visitors relaxed in warm pools without giving a second thought to the fires beneath their feet. Lucius smiled and quietly said, "The greatest parts of Rome are built by people nobody remembers." The words stayed with the attendant long after the conversation ended. The more years he spent working, the more he understood their truth. One afternoon, an unexpected crisis disrupted the usual routine. A blockage developed somewhere within the bath complex's water system. At first, the problem appeared small. Water flowed slightly slower than usual in one section of the building. Most visitors noticed nothing. However, experienced workers immediately recognized the danger. If the issue worsened, several pools might have to close entirely. The attendant joined a maintenance crew tasked with finding the source of the problem. For hours, they traveled through narrow service tunnels carrying lamps and tools. The passages were cramped, humid, and uncomfortable. Dust filled the air. Water dripped from stone walls. Finally, deep within a hidden section of the system, they discovered the blockage and worked tirelessly to remove it. By evening, the water flowed normally once again. The visitors never realized how close the baths had come to serious disruption. For the attendant, the incident served as another reminder of how fragile even the grandest Roman achievements could be. From the outside, the baths appeared permanent and effortless. In reality, they survived only because workers constantly solved problems hidden from public view. As autumn arrived, the crowd slowly diminished and life returned to a more familiar pace. The frantic energy of summer faded. Cooler weather brought smaller gatherings and quieter halls. The attendant found himself spending more time reflecting on the years behind him. He had watched countless visitors pass through the baths. Children he once saw accompanying their parents now arrived as adults. Young soldiers returned as veterans. Merchants gained fortunes or lost them, The city changed, yet the baths endured. Standing beside a pool one evening after closing time, he watched lamplight shimmer across the water and realized how much of his life had unfolded within these walls. Every memory seemed connected to the baths in some way. Every friendship, every challenge, every lesson learned. The realization did not make him sad. Instead, it filled him with quiet pride. His life might appear ordinary to others, but it had purpose. Day after day, year after year, he had helped sustain one of the greatest institutions in the Roman world. The visitors enjoyed comfort because workers like him arrived before dawn and remained long after sunset. They relaxed because unseen hands maintained the fires, cleaned the floors, repaired the pipes, and solved countless problems. Looking across the silent hall, he understood something many Romans never would. Greatness did not belong only to emperors, generals, and senators. Sometimes greatness lived quietly within ordinary people who performed their duties faithfully for an entire lifetime. And as the last reflections of lamplight danced across the still water, the forgotten bath attendant felt a deep sense of satisfaction knowing he had become one of those people. As middle age slowly gave way to old age, the bath attendant began noticing changes not in the baths, but in himself. The endless staircases seemed slightly longer than before. Heavy supply jars felt a little heavier each year. Long shifts left him more tired than they once had. Yet despite these changes, he continued working with the same dedication that had defined his entire life. The baths remained the center of his world, and every morning he still arrived before sunrise to begin another day. By now, he had become one of the oldest workers in the complex. Younger attendants treated him with respect, often seeking his advice whenever problems arose. New employees quickly learned that if they were unsure how something should be done, the old attendant probably knew the answer. Decades of experience had transformed him into a living source of knowledge. He remembered repairs made years earlier, understood the peculiar behavior of certain furnaces, and knew countless tricks that could only be learned through long experience. The baths themselves continued thriving. Every day thousands of Romans passed through the marble halls without realizing that some of the workers serving them had dedicated their entire lives to the building. The attendant often watched visitors come and go while reflecting on how temporary most things seemed. Customers changed constantly. Officials changed. Emperors changed. Yet the baths endured. Sometimes he would recognize a child visiting with his father and then, years later, see that same child return as an adult with children of his own. Time moved silently through the baths just as water flowed through the pipes beneath the floors. One winter, a particularly harsh cold season swept across the city. Demand for the heated rooms increased dramatically. Citizens crowded into the baths seeking warmth and comfort. The furnaces burned hotter and longer than usual. Workers labored tirelessly to maintain temperatures throughout the complex. For weeks, the attendant spent much of his time helping manage the increased workload. The furnace chambers became unbearably hot despite the freezing weather outside. Yet whenever he climbed back into the public areas, he saw grateful visitors enjoying the warmth and relaxation that the workers provided. The contrast reminded him once again of the invisible relationship between labor and comfort. Every pleasant experience enjoyed by guests depended upon someone else's effort. One evening during this busy winter season, a young attendant approached him with a question. The boy wanted to know how he had managed to spend so many years doing the same work without growing bitter or losing motivation. The old attendant thought carefully before answering. Finally, he explained that most people spend their lives chasing recognition. They want others to notice them, praise them, and remember them. But over the years, he had learned something different. Satisfaction came not from being noticed, but from knowing that one's work mattered. Every clean floor, every functioning furnace, every comfortable visitor represented a small success. No statues would ever be built in his honor, yet thousands of people benefited from his efforts every day. For him, that was enough. The young worker listened thoughtfully, and the attendant wondered whether the lesson would remain with him in the years ahead. As spring returned and the city became lively once more, the attendant found himself increasingly drawn to quiet moments of observation. During brief pauses in his duties, he would stand beside a pool or near a courtyard and simply watch the life unfolding around him. Children laughed while splashing water. Friends shared stories. Merchants discussed business opportunities. Elderly citizens relaxed in the warm air. The baths brought together every part of Roman society. Looking around, he realized that he had spent decades helping create these moments without ever truly participating in them. He had always remained behind the scenes, yet strangely he felt no regret. Witnessing these scenes had given his life meaning. He had spent years supporting a place where people could escape their worries, strengthen friendships, and enjoy simple pleasures. There was honor in that role even if it remained invisible. One night after closing time, he wandered through the empty halls while workers completed their final tasks. The pools were still. The marble floors reflected the glow of oil lamps. Steam drifted silently through the air. The baths seemed almost sacred in their quiet beauty. Standing alone in the vast complex, he realized that he had devoted more years to this building than many Romans devoted to any single part of their lives. The baths had witnessed his youth, his adulthood, and now the beginning of old age. They had become intertwined with his own story, and as he listened to the distant roar of the furnaces beneath the floor, he felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. His life might never appear in history books, but it had been filled with purpose. Day after day, year after year, he had helped sustain one of the greatest institutions of the Roman Empire. For a forgotten bath attendant, that was a legacy worth carrying into the years that remained. By now, the bath attendant had become an old man. His hair, once dark, had turned gray. Deep lines marked his face, carved there by decades of heat, steam, long hours, and endless work. The younger attendants who now filled the baths often found it difficult to imagine the complex without him. To many of them, he seemed as permanent as the marble columns themselves. He had been there before they arrived, and they assumed he would somehow always remain. Yet the old attendant knew better. Nothing lasted forever. Not emperors, not cities, not even the mighty Roman Empire itself. Time eventually touched everything. The realization no longer frightened him. Instead, it gave him a greater appreciation for the moments that still remained. Each morning, he continued arriving before sunrise, though his pace had slowed considerably. Tasks that once required little effort now demanded patience. Younger workers frequently offered assistance, but he rarely accepted more help than necessary. Pride still lived within him. He wanted to remain useful for as long as possible. The baths had given his life purpose, and he intended to honor that purpose until the very end. Nevertheless, he could not ignore the signs of age. His knees ached after climbing stairs. His back stiffened during long shifts. Sometimes he found himself pausing briefly in corridors where he once hurried without a second thought. The baths had changed little over the years, but his body reminded him daily that he had changed a great deal. One afternoon, while observing visitors gathered around a warm pool, He noticed a young father teaching his son how to use a strigil. The scene immediately stirred memories from decades earlier. He remembered seeing countless similar moments throughout his life. Children arriving at the baths for the first time. Young men boasting about future ambitions. Families spending peaceful afternoons together. Generations had come and gone while he remained in the background, watching silently. It occurred to him that he had witnessed a significant portion of Roman life unfold from within these walls. Historians might record the actions of emperors and generals, but the attendant had observed ordinary people living ordinary lives. In many ways, those everyday stories felt just as important. They were the true heartbeat of Rome. As the months passed, he increasingly found himself sharing stories with younger workers. During quiet moments, apprentices gathered around him to hear tales of the baths from years gone by. He spoke about famous visitors he had seen, unusual incidents he had witnessed, and challenges that workers had overcome long before the younger attendants were born. The stories were not dramatic. They contained no great battles or political conspiracies. Instead, they focused on ordinary moments of perseverance, teamwork, and responsibility. Yet the younger workers listened carefully. Through his stories, they gained a connection to a past they had never experienced. The attendant realized that knowledge, like the baths themselves, survived only when passed from one generation to another. One evening, after the last visitors had departed, he stood beside a pool he had walked past thousands of times before. The water was perfectly still. Reflections of oil lamps shimmered gently across its surface. For a long time, he simply stood there in silence. He thought about the frightened young worker who had entered the baths for the first time so many years ago. He thought about friends who had since disappeared from his life. He thought about furnace workers, cleaners, supervisors, visitors, and countless others whose paths had crossed his own. Most were gone now. Some had died. Others had moved away. Many had simply been forgotten. Yet their presence lingered in his memory. The baths felt filled with invisible echoes of all those lives. Looking across the quiet hall, he understood something he had never fully appreciated during his younger years. The true value of his life had not come from promotions, wealth, or recognition. It had come from consistency. Day after day, year after year, he had shown up and fulfilled his responsibilities. The work itself had often been difficult and repetitive, but over time those countless ordinary days had become something meaningful. Together they formed a lifetime of service. Not service to an emperor or a government, but service to a community. Thousands of people had enjoyed comfort because workers like him quietly performed their duties. It was not a glamorous legacy, but it was a real one. As he prepared to leave the baths that night, he paused one final time near the entrance. Outside, Rome glowed beneath the evening sky. The city remained busy, alive, and full of energy. Somewhere beyond the horizon, armies marched, politicians argued, merchants traded, and history continued unfolding. Yet within the baths, another kind of history existed, one made not by famous men but by ordinary workers whose names would never be remembered. The old attendant smiled softly as he stepped into the cool evening air. For most of his life, he had been one of those forgotten people. And strangely enough, he felt proud of that, because he had learned that even the quietest lives could leave behind a lasting impact, especially when they were lived with dedication, humility, and purpose. As the years drew closer to their end, the old bath attendant gradually began spending less time performing the most demanding physical tasks and more time guiding the younger workers who would eventually replace him. The supervisors trusted his judgment completely. When problems appeared, they often sought his opinion first. If a furnace behaved strangely, he knew where to look. If a pipe leaked, he often remembered previous repairs made decades earlier. If a young attendant struggled with a difficult visitor, he knew exactly how to handle the situation. His value no longer came from strength or speed, came from experience. Knowledge accumulated over a lifetime had become his greatest tool. The younger workers respected him not because of any official title, but because he had earned their trust through years of steady service. They knew that whenever he offered advice, it came from practical wisdom rather than theory. One spring morning, while walking through the baths before opening, he noticed how familiar every detail had become. The marble floors, the pools, the columns, the scent of warm water mixed with oil and steam. Everything felt deeply woven into his memory. He realized he could recall events connected to nearly every corner of the complex. One hallway reminded him of a flood that workers had stopped years earlier. Another brought back memories of a furnace failure during a harsh winter. A particular courtyard reminded him of a conversation with an old friend who had long since passed away. The baths had become a living record of his life. Every room contained memories invisible to everyone except him. Throughout that year, he increasingly found himself observing rather than participating. During busy afternoons, he would sometimes stand near the edge of a hall and watch visitors moving through the complex. Young men exercised in the palestra. Merchants discussed trade agreements. Families enjoyed time together. Elderly citizens relaxed in heated chambers. Nothing seemed unusual to them. They simply enjoyed the baths as Romans always had. Yet the attendant saw something more. He saw the continuation of a tradition that stretched back generations. Long before he arrived, other workers had maintained these same halls. Long after he was gone, others would continue doing so. He was only one link in a much longer chain. Surprisingly, that thought comforted him. He did not need to be remembered forever. It was enough to know that he had played his part. One evening, a young attendant asked him whether he regretted never pursuing a different life. The question caught him by surprise. He spent several moments considering it before answering. Certainly, he had never become wealthy. He had never traveled across the empire. He had never achieved fame or political influence. Many Romans would probably consider his life ordinary. Yet, as he reflected upon the decades behind him, he realized he felt very little regret. The baths had given him stability, purpose, friendships, and a place within his community. Every day his work had mattered to someone, even if those people never knew his name. There was dignity in that. Not every meaningful life needed to be extraordinary. Sometimes meaning came from simply doing one's duty well for a very long time. The young worker listened carefully, and the old attendant hoped the lesson would remain with him. As summer approached, the baths once again filled with visitors from every corner of the empire. The old attendant spent many afternoons listening to conversations from distant lands. Travelers spoke about cities he would never see. Soldiers described remote frontiers. Merchants discussed goods arriving from across the Mediterranean. In his youth, such stories might have filled him with envy. Now they filled him with curiosity and appreciation. He no longer felt the need to chase distant adventures. His own life had been rich in ways that younger people often overlooked. He had witnessed thousands of human stories. He had watched generations grow up. He had spent decades helping maintain one of the greatest public institutions in the ancient world. Looking back, He realized that an ordinary life could be surprisingly extraordinary when viewed across many years. One quiet evening after closing time, he walked slowly through the nearly empty baths. Workers completed their final tasks while lamps cast golden reflections across the water. The familiar sounds echoed softly through the halls. Somewhere beneath the floors, furnaces continued burning. The scene felt timeless. For a moment, he imagined all the workers who had come before him. Men whose names had vanished from memory, but whose efforts had shaped the baths just as surely as marble and stone. He felt connected to them in a way he never had before. Their lives, like his own, had been largely forgotten. Yet without them, the baths could never have existed. The realization brought him a deep sense of peace. History often celebrated emperors, generals, and conquerors, but civilizations survived because of ordinary people willing to perform necessary work day after day. As he stood beside the still water, watching the reflections shimmer beneath the lamplight, the old bath attendant understood that he had become one of those people. And for perhaps the first time in his life, he fully appreciated the quiet importance of that role. As another year passed, the old bath attendant began to understand that his time within the baths was slowly coming to an end. No official announcement had been made. No final day had been chosen. Yet he could feel the change approaching just as surely as a sailor senses an approaching storm long before it appears on the horizon. His body no longer recovered as quickly as it once had. Long shifts left him exhausted. Climbing stairs demanded effort. Even simple tasks required more energy than before. The younger workers noticed these changes as well, though they rarely spoke about them openly. Out of respect, they continued treating him as they always had. Yet more and more often, they stepped forward to carry heavy supplies or volunteered to complete difficult assignments before he could offer. At first he resisted their help, but gradually he accepted it. There was wisdom, he realized, in understanding when one season of life was ending and another was beginning. The baths themselves remained as lively as ever. Every morning crowds arrived through the great entrances. Water flowed through marble channels. Steam drifted through heated chambers. Conversations echoed beneath vaulted ceilings. To visitors, everything appeared unchanged. Yet the attendant now experienced the baths differently. Instead of focusing on daily responsibilities, he found himself noticing details he had overlooked for years. He paid attention to the way sunlight entered certain windows during different seasons. He listened carefully to the familiar sounds of water splashing against stone. He observed the reflections dancing across pool surfaces. These small details had always been present, but only now did he truly appreciate them. It was as if he were seeing the baths for the first time and the last time simultaneously. One afternoon, while standing near the entrance hall, he watched a young attendant helping an elderly visitor navigate the slippery floor. The scene instantly reminded him of himself decades earlier. For a brief moment, it felt as though time had folded back upon itself. The young worker moved with the same energy he once possessed. The elderly visitor walked with the same cautious steps he now used. Watching them, the attendant realized that life was not a straight road but a cycle. Each generation eventually became the one that followed before it. The realization brought neither sadness nor fear. Instead, it brought acceptance. This was simply the natural order of things. One evening after closing, several younger workers gathered around him while completing their final duties. What began as an ordinary conversation gradually turned into an evening of storytelling. They asked him questions about the baths from years gone by. Had famous visitors ever come here? What was the worst furnace failure he had witnessed? Was Rome different when he first started working? For hours he answered their questions, sharing memories accumulated across a lifetime. The young workers listened with fascination. Many of the stories involved people whose names had already been forgotten. Yet through his words, those forgotten workers briefly lived again. Furnace operators, cleaners, attendants, repairmen, and supervisors who had dedicated their lives to the baths were remembered, if only for a single evening. The old attendant realized that memories were perhaps the most fragile form of history. Once the people who carried them disappeared, entire lives could vanish forever. As autumn arrived once again, he spent increasing amounts of time simply observing the world around him. During quiet moments, he would sit beside one of the pools and watch visitors enjoying their day. He no longer felt the constant urgency that had defined much of his younger life. Instead, he experienced a sense of calm satisfaction. The baths were functioning well. The younger workers were capable and responsible. The traditions he had learned long ago would continue after he was gone. Nothing depended entirely upon him anymore, and strangely, that realization felt comforting rather than disappointing. It meant he had succeeded. He had become part of something larger than himself, and that larger thing would survive without him. One night, long after the final visitors had left, he walked alone through the baths. The halls stood silent. Pools reflected the soft glow of oil lamps. Steam drifted lazily through empty chambers. The immense complex felt almost sacred in the stillness. He moved slowly from room to room, revisiting places that had shaped his life. Here he had worked his first day. There he had helped stop a flood. In another hall, he had shared conversations with friends who were now long gone. Every corner contained memories. Every corridor carried echoes of the past. Reaching one of the largest pools, he stopped and gazed across the perfectly still water. For many years he had believed the baths belonged to Rome. But standing there in the silence, he realized they also belonged to the workers who had devoted their lives to them. Their labor lived within every stone, every pipe, every furnace, and every polished floor. Visitors saw marble and water. He saw generations of effort hidden beneath the surface. Looking at his reflection in the dark water, the old attendant smiled gently. His face was older now. His hair had turned white. Time had transformed him completely, yet he felt no regret. He had lived an honest life. He had served faithfully. He had helped thousands of people without ever expecting recognition. And as the quiet baths surrounded him one final time, he felt something he had not experienced in many years, a deep and lasting sense of peace. Soon another chapter would begin, both for him and for the baths. But for now, in the silence of the sleeping Roman night, he simply stood there and appreciated everything the forgotten life of a bath attendant had given him. In the final years of his life, the old bath attendant no longer measured time by the number of visitors who entered the baths or by the tasks waiting to be completed before sunrise. Those concerns now belonged to younger workers. Instead, he measured time through quieter things. The changing angle of sunlight across the marble floors. The arrival of spring after a long winter. The familiar sounds of water flowing through ancient pipes. The distant roar of furnaces that had accompanied nearly every day of his adult life. For decades, these sounds had blended into the background of existence. Now he listened to them carefully, knowing that nothing lasts forever. The baths remained magnificent. Crowds still arrived each morning. Merchants still negotiated business. Friends still gathered beside warm pools. Children still laughed in the courtyards. To the people of Rome, the baths seemed timeless. Yet the old attendant understood better than anyone that everything depended upon the efforts of ordinary workers. He had spent a lifetime witnessing how quickly order could become disorder if those workers stopped doing their jobs. Every polished floor, every heated room, every pool of warm water represented countless hours of unseen labor. Visitors admired the beauty. He admired the effort hidden beneath it. One morning, shortly after dawn, he arrived at the baths earlier than usual. The city was still quiet. A faint golden light illuminated the marble walls. For a few moments, he stood outside the entrance and simply looked at the building. He remembered the first time he had approached those same doors as a nervous young worker many decades earlier. Back then, the baths had seemed impossibly large. The responsibilities had seemed overwhelming. He could never have imagined spending nearly his entire life within those walls. Yet somehow the years had passed. One ordinary day had followed another until those countless days became a lifetime. Walking through the entrance, he realized that the baths had shaped him just as surely as he had helped maintain them. The building had become part of who he was. Throughout that final year, he spent much of his time teaching younger attendants. Not because anyone required him to do so, but because he wanted the knowledge to survive. He showed them how to recognize small problems before they became major ones. He explained the habits of the furnaces, the behavior of the water systems, and the countless details that books never recorded. More importantly, he taught them something deeper. He taught them that their work mattered. Most visitors would never notice them. Most would never learn their names. Yet every comfortable experience inside the baths depended upon people willing to perform unseen tasks with care and dedication. The younger workers listened respectfully. Some fully understood his lessons. Others would only appreciate them years later. Such was the nature of wisdom. Often it revealed its value only with time. As the seasons passed, the old attendant gradually reduced his responsibilities. Younger workers insisted on handling the heavier tasks. Supervisors encouraged him to rest more frequently. At first, this change felt uncomfortable. For so many years, work had defined his days. Yet eventually he learned to appreciate the slower pace. It allowed him to observe the baths from a different perspective. Instead of rushing from one task to another, he could simply watch life unfolding around him. He saw families enjoying peaceful afternoons. He saw friendships forming. He saw visitors escaping the worries of daily life. For decades, he had helped create these experiences without ever pausing to enjoy them himself. Now he finally had the opportunity. One evening, after the last visitors had departed, he walked alone through the baths one final time. The halls stood silent. Pools reflected the glow of oil lamps. Steam drifted through empty chambers. The familiar sounds of dripping water echoed softly through the vast complex. He moved slowly, stopping often to look around. Every room contained memories. Every corridor reminded him of people he had known. Friends who had laughed beside furnaces. Workers who had shared difficult shifts. Visitors whose faces had long since disappeared into history. Most of them were gone now. Yet, in a strange way, their presence still lingered within the walls. Reaching the largest pool, he stopped and gazed across the still water. The surface reflected both the lamps above and his own aging face. For a long moment, he simply stood there. Then he smiled. Not because he had lived an extraordinary life. Not because he had achieved fame or wealth. But because he had lived a useful life. He had spent decades helping others without expecting recognition. He had done his work faithfully. He had been part of something larger than himself. And in the end, that was enough. When he finally left the baths that night, he paused at the entrance and looked back one last time. The building stood quietly beneath the Roman sky, just as it had for generations. Tomorrow the furnaces would burn again. Water would flow. Visitors would arrive. Workers would begin their duties before sunrise. The baths would continue, just as they always had. The old attendant understood that this was not a sad ending. It was the natural continuation of a story much larger than any single person. Long after his name was forgotten, the lessons he had passed on would remain. The workers he had trained would teach others. The baths would continue serving the people of Rome. Life would move forward, and as he slowly disappeared into the quiet streets of the sleeping city, the forgotten bath attendant carried with him a simple truth learned over a lifetime. History is not built only by emperors, generals, and conquerors. It is also built by ordinary people who show up every day, perform their duties with care, and quietly dedicate themselves to serving others. Their names may vanish, their stories may fade, but their work lives on in the world they help create. And somewhere beneath the marble halls of ancient Rome, in the warmth of the baths and the glow of the furnaces, a small part of his legacy would remain forever.